We had been looking for a house for some time, but our budget didn't allow for anything extravagant. When we saw the listing for this place, it seemed perfect, the right size, a great neighborhood, and even close to the lake where we loved fishing and boating. The only thing that worried us was the potential price, which hadn't been listed. Still, we figured there was no harm in taking a look. When we arrived, we found Paul, the man currently working on the house. He was a real estate flipper, but not the kind you'd see on TV. He was an older guy, retired, and flipping houses was more of a hobby for him than a serious business. He'd buy wrecks at auction for dirt cheap, fix them up himself, then sell them off. While he worked on renovations, he lived off the profits from his last sale, which usually ran out just as he was finishing up his next project. He was careful with his money, but he wasn't rich. Paul had only gotten about halfway through fixing this place when we arrived. We stopped to say hello, and after some small talk, we asked about the price. He explained that he planned to finish the renovations before selling, and his realtor had just put the listing up early to attract potential buyers. The house still had a long way to go, holes in the walls, part of the floor in the living room missing entirely, exposing the basement below. The kitchen needed a full renovation, and most of the walls were covered in filth. It was clear the previous owner had been reckless, letting the place fall apart. And that brings us to the real beginning of the story. Before we bought the house, it belonged to a guy named Sam. But Sam didn't buy it himself, his mother, Claire, did. She was a wealthy woman who owned a significant piece of land near the lake. It wasn't exactly close to the water, but the only road leading to several popular beaches, resorts, and the busiest marina on that side of the lake ran right past her property. Because of that, land in the area varied wildly in price. Regular folks could afford properties farther from the shore, but anything closer was premium real estate, owned by the ultra-wealthy. Claire was well off and had a huge plot of land. When her kids grew up, she divided it into 4 sections. One part went to her daughter, surprisingly the only decent person in the family. Another went to Sam, and on both plots, she built houses for them based on their requests. The 3rd section held her own house, and the 4th? She put a small store on it, which would come into play later. Why she split the land this way, I can't say for sure. Maybe she was trying to prevent inheritance disputes. Whatever the reason, she handed over ownership rights to both of her kids, and you can probably guess what happened next. Sam was a complete disaster. He was irresponsible, a full-blown party animal, and the worst neighbor imaginable. His house became the site of constant wild parties, keeping everyone up at all hours. It got so bad that the police seemed to have assigned a dedicated officer just for his place. Calls to his address were that frequent. But did Sam care? Not in the slightest. His mother covered all his bills, water, electricity, trash collection, all in her name, with the invoices going to her mailbox. Except for one. Property taxes. Since the land was in his name, the tax bill came directly to him. And what did Sam do with it? Ignored it. Either Claire hadn't considered this little detail, or she assumed her son was paying the taxes himself. He wasn't. One day, after yet another police visit, Sam didn't come back. Instead, the house was suddenly up for auction. And that's when reality hit hard. The place was trashed. The constant parties and sheer negligence had left it in ruins. The bank had deemed it unlivable, meaning no one could get a mortgage to buy it. The only people who could afford it were those willing to pay in cash. That's how Paul ended up with it. He got the house for next to nothing and set about fixing it up. But it was no easy task. Holes in the drywall, a massive hole in the living room floor that led straight to the garage below, floors that needed full replacement, grime coating nearly every surface, the list went on. Paul, being the hands-on guy he was chipping away at the work himself when we met him. After talking for a bit, we made our offer. We were willing to buy it right then, as is, for a fair price based on its current condition. It wasn't perfect, but it had potential. And we could already see this house becoming our home. Paul considered it. He had a system, buy cheap, fix, sell, but the offer was tempting. If he took it, he wouldn't have to finish the work or wait months for a buyer. And that was just the beginning. We had told Paul that we were interested in finishing the renovations ourselves, but he initially declined. He explained that he already had multiple offers and didn't think it was right to sell the house in its unfinished state. Instead, he said we could buy it for full price once he had completed all the work. We thanked him, left our number, and asked him to call us if he changed his mind. Less than 2 weeks later, we got an unexpected call from Paul. His sister, who lived in another state, had fallen seriously ill, and he needed to leave to help take care of her. With no time or energy to finish the renovations, he was willing to sell the house to us as is, for a fair price, if we could find a way to buy it in its current condition. We jumped at the opportunity. Through a friend in real estate, we found a bank willing to finance the purchase, but there was a catch. We had 2 weeks to bring the house up to code. If we didn't, the bank would revoke the loan and put the house back up for auction. When we explained the situation to Paul, he offered to help however he could. Since he was leaving town and couldn't work on the house himself, he walked us through exactly what needed to be done to meet the minimum legal standards, how much work, time, and money it would take. But then, he went one step further. We took out a loan for double the cost of the house, and Paul gave us back half the money. That extra cash was enough to cover the renovations. Thanks to the work he had already done, we were actually pretty close to meeting the requirements. But just to be safe, we called in some friends and powered through the repairs in half the time. Even after bringing the house up to code, there was still a ton of work left. New floors, rewiring the electrical system, patching up the walls, and removing the disgusting, half-rotten wallpaper that had been glued directly onto the drywall. You know the kind. It was exhausting, but finally, after everything, we were moving into our dream home. Sure, there were still a few finishing touches to be done, but we were finally there. That's when Claire showed up. Paul had warned us about her, our self-important new neighbor, but we had no idea just how right he was. At first, Claire was incredibly friendly. She introduced herself, smiled, and chatted like the perfect neighbor. We didn't understand why Paul had been so adamant about warning us, until the very end of the conversation. With a sympathetic smile, she told us something that made our blood run cold. She claimed the house belonged to her, and that we had 30 days to move out. She spoke in this slow, almost pitying tone, telling us how sorry she was that we had been so cruelly deceived. But the house was hers, and Paul had no right to sell it to us. We had heard stories of real estate scams before, so you can imagine our panic when she said this. Had we been conned? Had we spent all that money, time, and effort fixing up a house that wasn't legally ours? Trying to keep calm, we thanked her for telling us, assured her we'd look into it, and immediately contacted the bank. The bank confirmed that Paul had been the legal owner of the house. Our realtor confirmed it. Then we called Paul. That's when he sighed and told us this wasn't the first time Claire had pulled this stunt. Ever since he had bought the house at auction, she had been harassing him, claiming he had stolen it from her family. Apparently, she had tried everything to make his life miserable while he was renovating it. And now that we were here, she was trying the same trick on us. We went to the courthouse and verified the deed ourselves. Our names were legally on the property. Then Claire showed up again. "When are you moving out?" she asked, like the last conversation had never happened. We told her, flat out, that we weren't leaving. We were the rightful owners. It wasn't our fault that her son had lost the house. We even tried to be polite about it. We told her we understood. It must be heartbreaking to lose a family property because of Sam's irresponsibility. But it wasn't our problem. We had worked too damn hard and spent too much money to give it up. That's when she changed tactics. She launched into this heart-wrenching speech about how the house had been in her family for generations, how she couldn't bear to see it gone, and how Paul had stolen it from them in the chaos of Sam's arrest. We asked her why, if it meant so much to her, she hadn't bought it back when it went to auction. After all, we had purchased it from Paul for just $50,000. Even with all the work he had put into it, he had only made a small profit. She could have reclaimed it for next to nothing. Her answer? She had refused to bid on the house because she believed it had been stolen from her family. She didn't think she should have to pay for something that was already hers. We had heard enough. We apologized again, but made it clear that we weren't about to lose all the money we had put into this house, especially after all the work we had done to bring it back to life. Still, trying to be reasonable, we made her an offer. She could buy the house from us for $100,000. Given its location and the condition it was in after all our renovations, this was just over half its actual market value. For reference, we had bought the place from Paul for $50,000, put another $30,000 into materials alone, and spent months of hard labor making it livable. We felt that our price was more than fair. Hell, we were even prepared to drop it to $90,000 if she wanted to negotiate. Instead, she countered with an insulting offer of $40,000. Her reasoning? She shouldn't have to pay for something that rightfully belonged to her in the first place. We told her flat out that her offer was way too low. She sighed dramatically, told us she understood that we had put a lot of effort and money into the house, and, as a gesture of kindness, raised her offer by another $10,000. That's right, $50,000 total. When we informed her that we had paid that exact amount just to buy the place, before any of the renovations, she snapped. She accused us of lying, stealing, and scamming her. She went off about how the house had been a wreck and there was no way anyone had paid that much for it. And then, in the middle of her rant, she made a mistake. She called our home a pile of garbage. Our dream home, the place we had bled and sweated over for months, putting every spare dollar into making it livable. That was the last straw. We politely told her to leave and made it clear she was no longer welcome on our property. We also told her that even if she did offer double the market value, we would never sell to her. Predictably, she lost it, screaming, cursing, and throwing every insult she could think of at us. And then, she started spreading rumors. At first, we ignored it. Who would actually believe that we had stolen her house? But then, something happened that we didn't expect. One afternoon, a man pulled into our driveway with a gun. He didn't point it at us, but he made it very clear that we needed to leave. We had never met him before, but we knew who he was. He was the so-called peacekeeper, a local man who had taken it upon himself to keep order in the area. He was well known and, despite his methods, was generally respected by most of the neighborhood. See, our town was split into two sections. One half was quiet, filled mostly with retirees who got along with everyone. The other half, a little less law-abiding. It was deeper in the woods, away from prying eyes. Our house, right on the border, separated from the rougher area by about a mile of forest and farmland. The peacekeeper had a reputation. In a rural town where law enforcement was spread thin, people liked having him around. He handled troublemakers better than the cops ever did. So why was he here, threatening us? We needed to find out. We invited him in, offered him a beer, told him he could keep his gun if it made him comfortable, but we'd have ours too. See, in our town, almost everyone owned a gun. There were more gun stores than dollar stores. If someone really wanted to threaten us, they'd have to be prepared for an actual fight. The peacekeeper agreed. For the next few hours, we talked. We explained everything. How we bought the house legally, how Claire's son had lost it fair and square, and how she was the one harassing us. By the end of the conversation, he sighed, nodded, and apologized. He admitted he had jumped to conclusions after hearing Claire's story. He thought we were just some out-of-towners who had pulled a shady deal. But after hearing the facts, he understood. More importantly, he remembered Sam. Once he put it together, he actually laughed. He told us that since Sam had lost the house, the whole neighborhood had been so much quieter. No more blasting music at 2 a.m., no more drunk idiots stumbling into traffic. With that, he left, no hard feelings. But Claire's downfall had just begun. See, her real mistake wasn't losing the house. Her real mistake was owning a store. That tiny, overpriced store she had built on her land. It was the only grocery store for miles, and that was the only reason it stayed in business. It sure as hell wasn't because of the prices, which were absurdly high, or the customer service, which consisted of Claire barely looking up and muttering, "Thanks for your purchase," as people walked out. Hell, the only good thing you could say about the place was that if you found mold on something you bought, you might get a refund. But people kept shopping there because they had no other choice. Until now, we had always tried to put our differences with Claire aside, even shopping at her store simply because it was the most convenient option. It was literally right down the street, after all. And because it was the only store within miles, it had built up a solid reputation in the community. People genuinely wanted to keep it running and would go to great lengths to defend it. I could understand that. At the time, most of the neighborhood still saw Claire and her family as respectable people. So, when she started spreading new rumors about us, people were inclined to believe her. The claims that we had stolen her house died out quickly. Everyone realized how ridiculous they were. But the other rumors? The little, petty accusations? Those had some staying power. Nothing major, just whispers and small complaints that people didn't really care about. And honestly, even if every single one of them had been true, some of our neighbors had done far worse. Most folks just ignored it. But because Claire was so vocal in her dislike of us, people started avoiding us. No one wanted to risk getting on her bad side and getting banned from her store. So, for the most part, people just stayed out of our way. Then, after a few years, Sam got out of jail. With nowhere else to go, Claire let him move back. But she wasn't stupid. She didn't want him crashing at her house. Instead, she rented him an apartment above her store and strictly forbade him from hosting any parties. Not that he was paying rent. The only thing she expected from him was to help run the store when she was busy, which, in reality, wasn't all that often. But even this was too much responsibility for Sam. Working the register, he repeatedly overcharged people, sometimes scanning the same items twice and pocketing the difference. We caught him doing it multiple times. Whenever we confronted him, he gave the same excuse. Oh, the register must have glitched. At first, we assumed it really was just a mistake. But after noticing a clear pattern, we brought it up to Claire. We explained that her son was likely scamming customers, skimming extra cash for himself. As arrogant as Claire was, she never seemed like the type to deliberately do something illegal. We liked having a store nearby and didn't want anything bad to happen to it. But instead of thanking us for looking out for her business, she laughed in our faces, accused us of lying, and, very politely, told us to go to hell. So we did. We took her advice, stopped shopping there completely, and quietly spread the word to a few trusted neighbors. It took years of being ignored because of Claire's influence. But people finally started talking to us again. And then something unexpected happened. We started forming real friendships. We began exchanging Christmas treats with neighbors, helping out with small tasks, actually being part of the community. Even if some of them didn't fully believe us about the store scam, the rumors spread. And before long, the peacekeeper returned. This time, though, he was far more relaxed. By then, we had gotten to know him casually. Not for anything serious, just neighborly chats. He would stop by for a beer, discuss what was happening in town, and get our thoughts on things. He did this with everyone, checking in at least once a year to keep a pulse on the community and maintain order. He hated unnecessary police presence in the area and saw himself as a better alternative. Honestly, his system worked. Thanks to him, kids could safely walk to the lake, even through the sketchier parts of town. He kept real trouble at bay. But despite his growing friendliness toward us, one thing did bother him. He hated that we were supposedly spreading lies about the store. He had already talked to Claire and her family. And of course, they played innocent. Claimed it was just a misunderstanding, an issue with the registers, nothing more. He made it clear that if we wanted to stay out of trouble, we needed to shut up about it. We wanted to show him proof. We wanted him to see what Sam was doing. But we knew he wouldn't believe us. He liked Claire. He had known her longer. And in his mind, it was easier to believe that we were stirring up drama than to accept that his longtime neighbor's son was a thief. So, we backed down. We apologized for the misunderstanding, told him we had just felt cheated, and assured him we wouldn't bring it up again. He accepted our apology, gave us a final warning, and left. From that point on, we refused to set foot in Claire's store unless there was literally no other choice. But everything changed a couple of years later. By then, the truth had spread so far that not even the peacekeeper could ignore it. And Claire's empire? It was about to crumble. People started checking their receipts after shopping at Claire's store, and soon enough, they began noticing the same patterns we had. Over time, Sam had likely stolen a massive amount of money from unsuspecting customers. And Claire? She definitely knew what was going on, but instead of fixing the problem, she focused all her efforts on shutting people up with more rumors. The problem with small-town stores like hers is that they depend entirely on loyal, local customers. Sure, during the warmer months, tourists and vacationers would stop by, and the store would make a solid profit. But that alone wasn't enough to keep it afloat through the winter. And then, it happened. The peacekeeper finally realized the truth. And holy hell, was he angry. We heard him yelling at Sam from across the property, his voice booming in the otherwise quiet neighborhood. Claire stood nearby, and for once, she didn't have a single thing to say. Hearing her get chewed out was extremely satisfying, but it was only the beginning. The peacekeeper didn't just confront them, he spent the entire rest of the day going door to door, telling everyone what had been happening at the store. And just to drive the point home, he carried stacks of receipts with him as proof. If there was anyone in town whose word held more weight than Claire's, it was his. And in less than 24 hours, he destroyed their business. Every single neighbor stopped shopping at the store. Sure, during the summer, Claire and Sam could barely keep it afloat thanks to out-of-town customers who didn't know any better. But when winter rolled around and those tourists disappeared, the store started bleeding money. By the second winter, Claire had no choice but to shut down for the season, which meant throwing away 90% of her inventory every fall and then spending a fortune to restock in the spring. It was an economical disaster. and after 3 more years, she had to close permanently. That's when her reputation, which she had spent decades carefully crafting, began crumbling completely. And as her influence faded, people started treating us like normal human beings again. For the first time since moving in, we could actually make friends without it being a massive uphill battle. People stopped avoiding us, stopped treating us like outcasts. But Claire's downfall was far from over, because there was still one last thing she was about to lose. And unfortunately for her, she had no one to blame but herself. One thing about Claire, she was ridiculously nosy. If we stepped outside for even a second, she'd somehow find an excuse to be out there too. Walking her dog, pulling weeds, raking leaves. It didn't matter, she would always be watching us. Not that we had anything to hide, but considering how hostile she had been toward us over the years, we weren't exactly thrilled about having her constantly spying on us. So when we decided to install a backyard pool and a heated hot tub, we knew one thing for sure. We weren't about to let Claire sit on her porch and watch us in swimsuits. The solution was simple. We would build a privacy fence. And, in an effort to be courteous neighbors, we let her know about our plans in advance. She immediately protested. We explained that, regardless of her opinion, we were going to install it. We still had to live next to her, so we tried to compromise. We offered to discuss details like the color and design so she wouldn't have to stare at something she hated. Since, staring at our property was apparently her favorite pastime. To avoid any legal disputes, we intentionally built the fence inside our property line, leaving a 30 centimeters gap between the fence and the official border of our land. That should have been the end of it. But then, we discovered something insane. When we double-checked our property records before installing the fence, we found out that Claire had illegally claimed about a third of our land. Right there, on our property, she had built a shed and even planted an entire garden. Apparently, she had always insisted that the land beyond the tree line belonged to her. But according to official records, it wasn't hers at all. When we confronted her about it, she lost her damn mind. She screamed, called us liars, thieves, every insult she could think of. Here's the thing, though. We didn't actually care about that piece of land. For years, we had assumed it was hers. It had never been an issue before. So, to make things easier for everyone, we gave her two options. She could buy the land from us for a reasonable price. Or, we could swap land. She had a small section next to our property that was a pain for her to maintain. It made sense to trade. She refused both options. She furiously declared that she would never pay for something that already belonged to her. And she certainly wasn't about to give us anything, because in her mind, we had already stolen too much from her. From that moment on, the battle over property lines officially began. Now, let me explain something about where we live. Like I mentioned before, this is a rural area, and property lines here can be weird. A lot of land deeds in the region were written hundreds of years ago and don't follow modern measurement standards. Instead of saying something simple like X meters and direction Y, many old deeds describe boundaries using temporary landmarks, stuff like from the large oak tree to the big rock by the creek. The problem? Most of those landmarks either don't exist anymore or could apply to multiple different places. So when I say land disputes here are common, I mean they're ridiculously common. And because even a tiny piece of land can be worth a fortune in the right circumstances, our state had to implement strict laws to regulate land disputes and protect the integrity of surveying work. For example, just a few years ago, a landowner successfully sued a major corporation over a 4-acre plot of land and walked away with over $1 million. The state doesn't mess around with survey fraud. If a surveyor falsifies data, even if it's just a minor mistake like being off by a few inches, they don't just get fined. They lose their license. Permanently. And that means they can never work as a surveyor in the state ever again. It's a career-ending mistake. That law exists to counterbalance the fact that big corporations could try bribing surveyors to cover their own losses. But no reasonable surveyor would ever risk their entire career for a bribe that wouldn't even come close to covering their losses. And that little legal fact? That's what saved our asses. Now, here's something a lot of people don't know. Most insurance companies don't cover damages caused by your property unless it directly affects you. For example, if a tree from your land falls onto someone's car, you're 100% responsible, even if it was due to a storm, and even if the car was parked on a public road. That's just how it works where we live. So, imagine our confusion when we received a bill from an insurance company, demanding that we pay for the damages done to some rich guy's sports car. Apparently, a tree had fallen on it during a storm. But here's the catch. The tree wasn't even on our land. We immediately called the insurance company and politely explained that the tree in question wasn't our responsibility. The agent took down our statement and said they'd investigate the matter and follow up with us. A week later, we got another letter from them. This time, they had attached a land survey map with the tree marked in red, and, according to their records, it was definitely on our land. The letter demanded full payment within 30 days, or they would take us to court. At that point, we had about 2 weeks left before they could escalate things legally. So we called them back and, once again, insisted they had made a mistake. At first, the agent argued with us, though in a much more polite way than how I'm about to phrase it. Essentially, he told us, "Do you seriously think we're going to believe that our official records are wrong? What, do you think land boundaries just magically shift around? Get real. We just gave him one name, the surveyor Claire hired to mark her property lines." The agent sighed loudly, muttered something about double-checking the facts, and said they'd be in touch. Oh, and they reminded us that we should start preparing to pay up, just in case our claim turned out to be false. But then, we never heard from them again. And here's why. That surveyor had everything to lose. If he had lied on Claire's survey, or even made an honest mistake, he would be facing crippling fines and would never be able to work in the state again. So, when the insurance company demanded clarification, he had no choice but to confirm the truth. That land and that tree weren't ours. Claire's mistake cost her big time. A couple of weeks later, we called the insurance company just to check in. The agent we spoke to this time actually sounded amused while reading the case notes. For legal reasons, he couldn't disclose everything, but he did tell us that Claire had also tried to dispute the claim, insisting that she didn't own the land either. Unfortunately for her, she had hired the surveyor. And since neither we nor the surveyor had challenged the original property records, the insurance company had no choice but to hold her financially responsible. They couldn't go after us. They couldn't go after the surveyor. So, Claire had to pay. Every last penny. And that was just the beginning of the consequences. As you might have guessed, Claire didn't struggle too much with covering the insurance costs. Sure, it probably pissed her off, but she had enough money to handle it without selling any of her land. Since then, we've mostly stayed quiet about the property dispute. Though, I'll admit, I've seriously considered saving up to hire a surveyor and taking back what's rightfully ours. At this point, it's not even about the land itself. It's about principle. Claire, however, still seems bitter as hell. It's almost funny. She basically got free land, yet she still isn't happy about it. What's there to complain about when you stole a chunk of someone else's property for free? Maybe she thought we'd keep fighting so she could play the victim again. But at this point, no one believes her anymore. Her son scammed the entire neighborhood. She knew about it, and she did nothing to stop it. And now, she's trapped. She can't start new rumors. They'd just backfire. She lost her business. She lost the neighborhood's trust. And now, we're just sitting back and watching as the fire she started burns everything down around her. Honestly, I can't wait to see what happens next. The most satisfying mistake she ever made. Now, for a bonus story, a little extra entertainment for those who enjoy some good karma in action. Back when we were planning the privacy fence, we also decided to install an invisible fence for our dogs. For those unfamiliar, an invisible fence is basically an underground electric wire that creates a boundary. The dog wears a special collar, and if they get too close to the boundary, the collar emits a high-pitched sound they really don't like. If they ignore the sound and keep going, they get a mild electric shock. Not painful, just a light zap to discourage them from crossing the line. We're not huge fans of shock collars, so we tested it ourselves first. Yes, I literally put on the collar and walked across the boundary. It was not painful, just a weird tingling buzz. More annoying than anything. The idea was to train the dogs to respond to the sound, so they'd never even need to feel the shock. This was the best way to give them freedom in the yard. Back then, we couldn't afford a full fence yet. So, we installed the wire far inside our own property line, both because of the wire length and because we wanted to keep the dogs well away from the property boundaries, just to be safe. And then, one hilarious day, Claire made one of her dumbest mistakes ever. She must have assumed the wire marking the boundary was for a future fence or something, because while mowing her lawn, she ran it over with her electric lawnmower. Now, remember, this wire was over 5 feet inside our property, nowhere near her land. And as we all learned that day, electric lawnmowers do not handle electric wires very well. Her mower fried itself instantly. The electronics were completely shot, and she had to buy a brand new one. And the best part? Because the wire was so far inside our property, she couldn't even blame us. She didn't even try to ask us to pay for a new mower, probably because she knew exactly what our answer would be. And that made it even better.